Hey, welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Luca. Welcome to Look at Me Look, where you get to look at me look at YouTube videos. The title of today's video is The Fallen of World War II by Neil Halloran. Now, normally when I do reaction videos, I have my ridiculous intro theme that plays, but on videos like these, I prefer not to play my intro. I think it would just seem, bit of a breach of taste to have this bouncy upbeat music playing with me smiling and giggling before a video like this. I think that is a bit of like a distasteful thing. So I'm gonna skip my intro and I'm gonna go right into reacting this video. So here we go, The Fallen of World War II. In 3, 2, 1.
The average lifespan of an American is 80 years, and an 80-year-old today was 10 when World War II ended, 4 when it began. A soldier who saw battle would have to be in his late 80s at least today. Generals, political leaders, the decision-makers of the war, few are still with us. And over the past few decades, we've seen authors and filmmakers rush to capture stories from survivors before this connection with memory is lost. This project is not about individual war stories, and it's not about survivors. We're going to tally up the tens of millions of people whose lives were cut short by the war, and see how these numbers stack up to other wars in history, including trends in recent conflicts. We'll be counting soldiers and civilians separately. Each of these figures represents 1,000 people.
1,000 precious souls.
Civilians were of all walks of life.
Per little blob.
Whereas military deaths were almost entirely men. The average age was about 23.
That's incredible.
In most battles, for every 1,000 soldiers killed, there are more than 1,000 who were injured. The word casualty can be confusing because in military speak, it often includes both deaths and injuries, and anything else that takes a soldier out of service. Here, we're just counting the deaths. And we'll begin with American soldiers.
Man. Good Lord.
Over 400,000 died. Most of the deaths occurred in the European theater, fighting the Nazis. And about a quarter were in the Pacific, fighting the Japanese. When you put them on the timeline, you see that casualties were the heaviest at the end of the war. The war began on September 1st, 1939. But the US wasn't willing to join the fight until Pearl Harbor, 2 years in. The deaths increased drastically on D-Day, when the Allies invaded Normandy. One of the most tragic moments of the war was on D-Day at Omaha Beach, where 2,500 Americans fell.
That's incredible. It's heartbreaking.
So about the same number of US soldiers died on this single beach landing as the entire 13 years of the recent war in Afghanistan.
These brave people just... I don't know if I would have the courage to do what they did.
The bloodiest battle in the Pacific was Okinawa, which lasted 82 days, during which 12,500 Americans died.
These are real photos from the battlefield. Good Lord.
About 5,000 of these deaths were at sea from kamikaze.
Good Lord. Can you imagine that?
Now let's look at some other countries, starting with Europe. Germany started World War II when it invaded Poland. Poland ultimately lost 200,000 soldiers in the war.
Good grief.
Most died after the invasion while the country was occupied by Germany and the Soviet Union. Germany, meanwhile, lost just 16,000 in the invasion of Poland. The Nazis went on to invade and conquer other countries, including Denmark, Belgium, the Netherlands, France, Greece, and Yugoslavia. France surrendered, but after losing 92,000 soldiers in the Battle of France. Over 200,000 ultimately fell, which includes deaths in POW camps, French colonies, and other fighting. Yugoslavia suffered almost 500,000 military deaths. The initial invasion brought relatively few casualties on both sides. But the deaths mounted under Nazi occupation due to guerrilla fighting, civil conflict, and mass executions.
Good Lord Almighty. Think about that. Every single one of those.
The Nazi invasions were swift,
1,000.
with relatively few German losses. Even the Nazi commanders expressed surprise at their success. And then we have the United Kingdom and the United States, who were not invaded but took the fight to the Nazis. Britain lost about the same number of soldiers as the US, which includes the British colonies. Germany lost about 500,000 soldiers fighting the US and Britain in what is known as the Western Front, which took place in France and Belgium.
Those were some crazy battles.
But most Nazi soldiers died in the Eastern Front. Germany's unsuccessful invasion of the Soviet Union.
Good.
The numbers are staggering.
Good grief.
The most famous battle of the Eastern Front, and perhaps the turning point of the European war, was Stalingrad. The German Sixth Army successfully took Stalingrad, but then got surrounded by the Soviets and cut off from food and ammunition. 500,000 Nazis would ultimately die in Stalingrad. Another 100,000 were taken prisoner, of which 6,000 would ever return. POWs had a low survival rate throughout World War II, and it was particularly grim in the East. When you include these POWs, roughly the same number of Germans died in Stalingrad as all the Western Front fighting against France, the UK, and the US. And though Stalingrad was a victory for the Soviets, they suffered almost twice as many losses as Germany.
Good grief. My God.
The Soviet Union would eventually defeat the once unstoppable German army, killing 2.3 million Nazi soldiers.
These numbers. What the hell?
But winning the war came at a cost.
Jeez, man. It's like a pile of carcasses that you could stack higher than, like, man. Like the Empire State Building. A pile of carcasses much higher than that. Jesus. The stories I heard about what, soldiers and civilians in the Soviet Union did, like the level of sacrifice that they did, it's crazy. Running up to cannons of tanks, wrapping themselves around them, blasting themselves open,
8.7
just to temporarily stall the tanks whilst their comrades would flee somewhere
hotly
else.
Disputed
I've
number.
heard these stories like that.
Some studies have calculated as many as 14 million dead. To complete the count of European military deaths, we need to add German deaths from other fronts, including the North and Africa,
just soldiers.
As well as deaths from other Axis powers allied with the Nazis.
This is just soldiers.
Hungary, Romania, and Italy.
Good Lord.
When you put these European military deaths on the timeline, it looks like this. You can now interact with the chart to learn more. Pause the narration if you would like more time.
These are average age 23-year-olds, like a year older than my brother.
And now we switch to civilian deaths in Europe.
Good Lord. Jews.
6 million Jewish people were killed in the Holocaust.
Man.
If you separate this by country, you see that about half, 2.7 million, were Polish. 700,000 were Soviets, followed by Hungary and 17 other countries.
Yeah, from Belgium.
Broken down another way, about half of the 6 million were killed in the concentration camps. Over 1 million died in Auschwitz. Most were killed in the gas chambers. Others died from starvation, exhaustion, disease, and other forms of execution. The second most deadly camp was Treblinka, which was exclusively an extermination camp, set up to look like a train station.
All right, let me just pause this for a second. So actually I have a personal story to tell on this front. On my mom's side, my grandfather, his family got exterminated during the Holocaust. So he was, my grandfather, when he was little, when he was like 10 or so, he went to the cinema, and he just came back one day from the cinema, and his neighbor, in a hush-hush kind of way, saying, "Quick, Maurice, hide, they're looking for you." So this little boy, confused as hell, just ran away. Basically, it turns out that the Nazis had arrested his mom and dad, and they were looking for him. And so he was able to be moved around through this underground resistance network from one individual to the next until he was placed in the hands of a Belgian family that absorbed him as one of their own. They changed his name, they changed his identity, and essentially they were masking him from the Nazi reach. And they basically welcomed him as one of their own, as a real son of theirs, and they got along well. But his parents were never seen again. We did some digging on this, like on my family side, trying to figure out what happened, and we found out that his mom and dad, right, they were taken to Auschwitz, and the mom was killed on the day that she arrived in Auschwitz, and the dad was killed after several months doing manual labor. And the way that it worked out, and I apologize if this is going to sound extremely visceral and graphic, but I just want to paint a picture for you just to understand, what goes on to individuals who go through this kind of process. I don't know if you've ever seen these videos of these Tokyo underground subway things where people are essentially shoehorned into carriages. They're pressed. You have people pushing them like a can of sardines just to fit in these carriages. Right now, imagine these air conditioning carriages, right, transformed into wooden carriages, right, who don't have windows but they have openings, no air conditioning. And imagine being packed like that, like a can of sardines into those, in the middle of winter in Europe, where it can reach minus 10 degrees Celsius. And instead of a 20-minute trip, it's a 3-day trip. Now, think about that, packed like a can of sardines in one of those things for 3 days. And I don't know if you've ever done like an all-nighter before, where you've worked all night and you literally haven't slept. Literally the next morning, if you haven't slept, you just shiver uncontrollably. You have, your immune system is compromised and you react really badly to like wind chill. Now, just imagine 3 days straight of you sleeping in a standing position, right, like a can of sardines, and defecating and urinating on yourself, right? Just imagine what that does, and what that does to you in terms of your pride and your dignity. If you're packed tightly in a carriage with your friends, with your family, with your neighbors, with your children in front of you, and you're urinating on yourself, what does this do to your self-esteem? To have your loved ones witness you do this, and you in turn do it with them. What does this do to your morale? And you're confused, you're shivering uncontrollably, you're sleeping, your people in your carriage are freezing to death, and you arrive at what looks like a work camp, a military work camp. You don't know what's going on. The moment that you get off the train, every single female, I'm speaking to you as a man here, every single female member of your family, every single female neighbor you have, every single sister, cousin, aunt, daughter, they immediately get taken away from you. Passengers are segregated with males on one side and women and children on the other. And women and children are basically marched immediately to the gas chambers to be killed. And the men are split into the elderly and wounded, disabled, etc., and men who can do manual labor. And those who can't do the manual labor are also sent to the gas chambers to be killed. And for men who can do the manual labor, they're overworked, they're underfed, they undersleep, and very soon they start looking emaciated and angular, bony, anorexic. And I don't know if you've seen these things, but the way that these people sleep in their work shelters, they basically, because of how skinny they look, they're basically stacked like rods of timber on top of each other. And they don't take showers, anything, for months. They just work all the time. And the moment that they collapse from exhaustion, they're mercilessly just dragged into the gas chambers and killed with everyone else. And with the gas chambers, people, the way that things would work out is that they would, people would obviously not be told that they would be marching to their deaths. Normally, in order to prevent any anticipation for violence and outbreak and resistance, they would inform the women and children who arrived, and later the other men, that they would be delousing them. They would say that we have a lice problem here, so we need to send you to the showers. And they would shave women's hair off, and under the pretext that this was for delousing, when in reality it could be used to make hair. They would remove golden teeth to be used elsewhere for, like, they would melt it down and make it into something else. They would remove watches, jewelry, all that stuff. They would just create a pile of jewelry and valuables. They would strip people down to their naked, and then they would be marched like an entire cohort of 1,000 people into what looked like a gigantic shower room. And they were there. They would take these hot showers, and the engineers of Auschwitz, these concentration camps, they really designed these gas chambers, right, to be integrated into the showers themselves. So the plumbing that connected to the gas canisters of Zyklon B, right, these were integrated into the shower heads themselves. So you would go there, people would take these hot showers. These showers would open up their pores in their skin, and this would make their ability to absorb Zyklon B gas much faster because the pores would be open. And then all of a sudden, the Zyklon B gas canisters would be open. They would atomize and vaporize, and this vapor would be funneled through these the ducting and evacuated and sprayed and infused into the shower rooms. People would start screaming. They're trembling. It's dark in there. There's no lights on in these showers, and people would essentially choke. They would die. And outside of these gas chambers, there's these really frightening stories that you hear about how the staff members that work there, among other people, they hire what are called Jewish rats. Jewish rats are essentially Jews that essentially manually remove the corpses from these gas chambers. And they'd be waiting outside till the screaming stops. By the time the screaming was over, they'd open the doors of these gas chambers. And because of how tightly packed people were in there, like can of sardines, people were dead standing up, stiff, rigor mortis, basically an endless sea of stiff vertical columns of dead people. You'd open the door and there'll be like an avalanche of like 20 stiff dead bodies that would melt through the door as you opened it because they were stuck like that. And there's these horrible stories of mothers being dead, stuck into place, hugging their children. It's really, really, really horrible. And what's really frightening as well, which is very bizarre, was that typically when you would open these gas chambers and you'd have this inflow of air that would permeate the room, there would be almost like a reflexive behavior among some of these dead bodies in there to gasp for air. And this was just a reflex. It's like you would tap on your knee, on your patella, and it would raise your knee. It was a reflexive behavior. They were clinically dead already, but it made it look really, really insidious. And immediately after that, they would be dragged into either mass graves or into the crematories. And this story is crazy, but then eventually extermination camps afterwards, concentration camps became more and more extermination camps. So Treblinka is an example of this, where they essentially convinced the passengers of these trains that the destination was not a extermination camp, but a train station. They made the extermination camp look like a train station. And so people would get off the trains, they'd go there in boarding and waiting rooms, they'd be waiting for the next train. And the level of, the extent to which the Nazis convinced these passengers that things would be okay in order to disarm them was really, really sinister. You'd have fake train schedules, fake timetables, fake leaflets, fake tickets. All of these things were just there in place to deceive the passengers and keep their guards down. They'd be put into these waiting rooms, waiting for the trains to arrive, and then these waiting rooms would be locked. And on the outside, you'd have these massive German Panzer tanks with the cannons on them. They would attach a duct to the exhaust of that tank and connect it to the vent of these waiting rooms. They turn the tank on, and then it would explode out this plume of carbon monoxide that will be funneled right into the room and kill everybody. They'll all suffocate. And eventually, it reached a stage where this was really upscaled extermination. This was really, really crazy, and it was absurd the degree to which they became extremely quick at doing this and efficient. And ultimately, their strategy then pivoted into, let's not kill people in the camps, but let's kill people on the way to the camps. So they started retrofitting the vehicles that transport people to quote-unquote supposed destinations with the instruments and the machinery that enables them to gas the passengers. And, by the time they arrive at the destination, they're already dead in order to reduce the risk of uprising. So when I'm telling you all this stuff, you're recoiling, thinking, what on earth is this bizarrely evil stuff? People are monsters, they're evil, these are psychopaths. Well, the reality is no. It's a very reductionist view and it's very reductionist to immediately deduce from this that humans are evil and they're psychopaths. I would one of the reasons I'm saying this is actually I recommend each and every one of you, if you ever go to New York City and go to the Holocaust Museum, there is this thing that was recently discovered. Sorry if I'm taking time out of this video, but this is just some thoughts I'd like to relay. There was recently something that was added in the Holocaust Museum that was discovered in an attic in Germany a few years ago. And when you open this album, it's basically a photo album. And what do you see inside this photo album? You see, men and women in the prime of their lives, smiling, beaming at the camera, telling jokes to each other, sunbathing. You see them eating fruits, and when you look at these pictures, they're smiling, they're filled with a zest for life, they're jubilant, and they're looking, you're smiling at them. They must be. It almost resembles like university students, posing for a photo before a night out, during pre-drinks. Basically, these are men and women in the prime of their lives, just ready to enjoying themselves, right? Telling jokes to each other, looking at each other in the face. You can see the glint in their eyes. They're beaming at each other. And as you keep on turning these pages, you realize that these people are in fact the staff, the workers that operate the Auschwitz concentration camps. These are the people that actually kill Jews by the thousands per day. And when you it's really is what's crazy about this is that we realize that the place that they are in fact is this chalet that is pretty much adjacent to the Auschwitz concentration camps, and there they are, in these pictures, sunbathing, beaming, eating fruits like this, and this chalet is essentially blanketed by a thin plume of human ash that is evacuated from the chimneys of the crematories at Auschwitz. So, when you realized what's going on here, it totally disarms you. When you see these people smiling and beaming, you relate to them, you connect to them. And then when you realize what they were involved in, this is completely it shatters you. You don't know what to make of this. And, because these people clearly are experiencing states of well-being, of emotional states of consciousness that every single one of us would be experiencing. You identify so much with them in these pictures before you know what they're up to. And I would hedge, just like others, that when you look at these pictures, few of these people are actually sociopaths or psychopaths. It's just that they have been gently indoctrinated into this, into harboring this belief system that enables them to segregate human beings into what is considered human and subhuman. And in their view, it's not necessarily an evil what they're doing. They literally feel like the people that they are exterminating in these gas chambers are beneath them, that they can be stepped on, that they are subhuman, that they are just a scourge on the earth. And it enables them to really have a complete absence of remorse and guilt when they put these people to death. And it's one thing that is really it makes you realize, first of all, that human beings harbor the ability to be evil. They can be influenced very, very gently by policies of systems to make them evil and to carry out evil actions without necessarily feeling any sense of, oh, I'm doing the wrong thing. And when you even think about systems themselves are comprised of individuals. The nodes in these systems are individuals, and they are reverberating sentiment through this system that is channeling this behavior into people who are embedded into the system. So beneath it all, whatever you want to call it, propaganda, policies, what undergirds all of this is people. And how on earth do people get to a state where they're able to carry out actions that are so, beneath the pale, some stuff beyond the pale that what we would be carrying out normally, and how they get to that state whilst being completely stoic and indifferent to how they were doing it. It just goes on to show you that, you don't need these abrupt instructions of do evil to be evil. It can be just very slow, gradual, gentle, but consistent push towards that direction until you reach a certain point where essentially your moral compass becomes unhinged, and you have these absolutely decoupled perspectives about who is allowed to live and not. And I think this is a sober reminder that, the evil lies in each and every one of us. There's good and there's bad in each and every one of us, and it's not necessarily clear to everyone just how easy it is to fan the embers of the evil in us all. It's very difficult to get someone, when I was first confronted with these kinds of things, I really needed other people to make sense of this for me, because I was conflicted about how to interpret this reality. I could feel mixed emotions, but I was unable to verbalize what I was thinking about. And I'm still not able to do it, but it's just completely sinister and insidious how human beings are capable of doing this. It's just absolutely heartbreaking just seeing all this stuff.
Mobile killing groups killed 1.4 million Jews.
Yeah, this is ridiculous. Look at this picture.
Like with the gas chambers, men were killed first to reduce the risk of revolt.
Look at this picture. He's hugging his little child. Good Lord Almighty. These people were just brutally retired from existence. All of these little traditions and little things they like to do.
The Holocaust also includes non-Jewish deaths. Between 130,000 to 500,000 Roma, then called
in an
gypsies,
instant they go from a living sentient being to just
about 250,000 people with disabilities.
Piece of meat that's rotting.
Homosexuals, Catholics, and other groups were also exterminated, but their numbers were relatively small. Some historians say that other civilian deaths should go under the label of Holocaust. About 2 million non-Jewish Poles were killed under German occupation, some of which were sent to the gas chambers at Auschwitz. When you combine civilian and military deaths, over 16% of the total Polish population died in World War II, which is the highest percentage of any country. But not the highest in total death count. The Soviet Union again tops that list, losing at least as many civilians as it did soldiers, somewhere between 10 and 20 million. A particularly dark moment for the Soviet Union was the siege of Leningrad, now St. Petersburg. German forces surrounded Leningrad before civilians could be evacuated. Supplies, including food, were cut off for 2.5 years.
These pictures, heartbreaking.
1.5 million people died as a result, mostly from starvation, mostly civilians. Stalin's cruelty towards his own people is partly responsible for these numbers. He often didn't allow civilians to evacuate from cities, thinking it would cause the soldiers protecting them to fight harder. About 1 million Soviets died in Stalin's own labor camps, called the Gulag. Just about every country suffered civilian losses, especially countries who were invaded. While many died as a result of so-called collateral damage, the biggest numbers occurred when it was no accident. Civilians were exterminated, purposely fired upon or bombed, used as human shields, or intentionally deprived of food. The intentional killing of civilians was done by most warring parties, including the United Kingdom and the United States. The United Kingdom was spared of a land invasion, but still lost 60,000 civilians, largely from German air raids or blitzes, often directed at civilian population centers. The UK did the same to German cities at a much greater magnitude, causing about 10 times the number of deaths. But most German civilian deaths came from the ground at the late stage of the war. When the Nazi regime collapsed, civilians living in occupied regions had to desperately flee from the advancing Soviet army. Rapes were widespread, and death estimates ranged from 600,000 to 3 million.
Good Lord Almighty.
Let's step back and see where we are with the totals.
Civilian casualties, 22 million?
We just counted about 20 million civilian deaths in Europe.
Good grief.
If you add this to the European military deaths we already covered, it brings us to over 40 million. Then we have the Asian theater.
Good grief.
Here we see the vast majority of military deaths in Asia came from China and Japan. On the civilian side, about 6 million deaths from China, Indonesia, Korea, Indochina, and the Philippines can be attributed to Japanese war crimes, which are sometimes compared to the Nazi atrocities due to the sheer scale of the
Unit 731.
China had the second highest death count after the Soviet Union. And like the Soviets, the Chinese government demonstrated a stunning willingness to sacrifice its own people. Chinese nationalists opened the dike at the Yellow River, hoping
What?
the flood would halt the Japanese advance.
No.
500,000 Chinese civilians or more were killed, which is 2 or 3 times the number who died in all countries in the 2004 Asian tsunamis. But the invasion of China only cost Japan 200,000 soldiers. Most were killed fighting the US and allies in the Pacific War. A significant portion of Japanese civilian deaths were caused by American firebombing and the 2 nuclear attacks. Contrary to official US statements, these airstrikes were directed at civilian populations, not military targets. When you add all the deaths outside Europe, it brings us to a grand total of 70 million for the war, give or take depending on who's counting and what civilian deaths get included. More people died in World War II than in any other war in history. For comparison, here are 20 or so of the very worst wars and atrocities we have on record. Some of these are more of atrocities than wars, but we've seen how that distinction can get blurry. Some of these spanned across centuries. World War II had the highest body count, and it all happened in just 6 years. The world's population has grown significantly since the earliest atrocities on this list. If we want to compare them in terms of what percentage of the world died, we can adjust the chart to look like this. This rough approximation tells us there may have been more devastating wars before World War II, proportionally speaking.
70 million people, man. 70 million people.
When we turn to post-war conflicts, it's hard to say anything that isn't controversial. But the data shows something quite extraordinary has been happening. In 1989, John Gaddis coined the phrase the long peace to identify the absence of conflict between the nuclear powers during the Cold War. 25 years later, the Cold War is over, and the term is still being used, although its meaning may have shifted. European countries have not fought each other, except for this 10-day war in 1956 when the Soviet Union invaded Hungary. When we look at European wars before World War II, it looks like this. They tend to be more frequent as you go back, though smaller in scale. And the largest 44 economies of the world have not battled each other since World War II. Rich countries have fought poorer countries, like the US versus Iraq, but rich countries have not fought other rich countries. Such a period of peace between the so-called great powers hasn't been seen since the Roman Empire. To many, peace is too strong of a word. Wars have occurred since World War II, and they can be grouped into these 4 categories. We don't see colonial wars anymore. We've already noted that interstate wars between rich countries have not occurred at all, and here we see wars involving smaller economies have tapered off. That leaves civil wars of 2 types, with and without foreign intervention. And this is what these battle deaths look like alongside of World War II. More people died fighting in World War II than in all the wars since. And again, we can't forget about world population, which has almost tripled since World War II. If we scale these numbers to show deaths in proportion to world population, showing the likelihood that a person on Earth dies in battle, the downward trend becomes even more pronounced. Now, this isn't to infer anything about why this trend is occurring. That's a discussion for another day. You can now interact with this chart to explore what conflicts are behind the totals. Now, bear in mind, we're just looking at battle deaths here, not civilian deaths, but those too are in decline. Peace is a difficult thing to measure. It's a bit like counting the people who didn't die in wars that never happened. We give such importance to the word peace, but we don't tend to notice it when it occurs or report on it. Sometimes it takes reminding ourselves of how terrible war once was to see the peace that has been growing around us. Of course, this trend may not continue, and it's not clear how looking at these charts can help us make the right decisions to ensure that it does. But the longer the long peace grows, the more significant it becomes. So if watching the news doesn't make us feel hopeful about where things are heading, watching the numbers might.
Unbelievable. Our future selves are watching ourselves now through their memories. This video is still going on right now. We need to make sure that we carry ourselves correctly. Good Lord. Good Lord, good Lord. Good Lord. Man, really depressing stuff.
If you would like to support this project and encourage new episodes, please follow us using one of the options below. And consider paying the suggested ticket price for today's show. Thank you very much.
Thank you for making this video. It's very moving. Very moving. It took a lot for me not to just, well up in front of you. Just trying to stay focused on the video and what they're saying. Don't want to miss anything. But man, just cry myself to sleep tonight, man. This is absolutely heartbreaking. Also, the way that World War II is deeply embedded into the carnage that existed in my family's past. I think this video resonates a lot with me. I see little Belgium, but even irrespective of what little Belgium endured, just the scale of, immiseration that ensued from World War II for all the communities of the world, for all the countries of the world, all the people of the world is really, man, it almost feels like World War II was this, throughout the ages we've had conflicts, right? They became bigger and bigger, and then World War II was that overshoot conflict where we overshot what savagery and carnage and violence were capable of, and we immediately recorrected for that by saying, okay, we're not doing that again. Let's recalibrate back to a more stable norm, and let's try to avoid conflict, almost like by temporarily going and creating hell, we realized we have no business doing this anymore. Let's stop. I think World War II is one of those very interesting scenarios where it wasn't just factions fighting each other for geopolitical objectives. There was on one side this absolutely perverse extermination mindset of a certain subset of people. How this was institutionalized, how this was industrialized, and how ordinary people who you would deem as no different than your own fellow countrymen and women, how these people would be capable of executing such heinous crimes completely nonchalantly. I think that this is one of these, it's a social phenomena that I think we need to deeply reflect on as a population, how it is that people can actually do this. There's been absolutely, there's been terrible conflicts in the past, there's been real bad stuff that has happened, but the proximity that World War II has to the modern day, how close it wasn't so long ago, it's jarring that we human beings are capable of doing this. And I really hope that, and this is my own perspective on this, is that I think that it is important that we preserve heritage, whether it be good or bad. This is just my perspective. And, let's at least place the really bad stuff for example, in a museum, because this forces people to be able to walk in these empty hallways with these monuments and of these people that we don't necessarily celebrate, but we need to remind ourselves of what we can do if we are not careful. We need to be vanguards of these positive ideals, and we can only do so by being reminded of how bad we can be if we do not do so. And these are sober reminders that the Third Reich and all these other things. These are sober reminders of how low humanity can go, and we really need to be very careful. It's just a very, very powerful video. When you think about one of those singular human icons that captured 1,000 human beings, a singular human being was 1/1000th of that icon. that one single human being has its traditions, has its memories, has its youth, its childhood, its memories of spending time eating good, eating flavorful experiences, learning their place in society and these kinds of things. And this little being, so to speak, struggling to make their way through the world, is embedded into these systems where just they can be rocked left, right, and if they're not careful, then they can be brutally retired from existence, and you extinguish that little story of consciousness, and that's for one single one of those beings. Life is so much better. I mean, life is so wonderful. Conscious beings. I think we should celebrate the fact that there is consciousness and sentience, and to extinguish even that for a single organism, that is, that was worth so much less because of it, and for that to occur on a scale of 70 million people plus during World War II, this is one of the biggest lows in human history. But like from this destruction arose a refound sense of communionship, camaraderie, a cultural exchange and a cultural understanding and mutual accordance among nation states to really never do this again. I think World War II is just one of those things that it showed how bad we could get during a period of time when our technological capability really enabled us to really amplify evil really badly, but not to the degree that it can today. And I think that it occurred in a period of time that reminded us just how when you combine how barbaric people can be whilst mildly also seeming sophisticated with technology, then you get absolutely bad outcomes. I don't know if you've seen in Schindler's List that scene when the Nazis storm into a Jewish ghetto. They basically in the middle of the night to try and annihilate all the inhabitants over there, and they do so under the cover of darkness, surreptitiously creeping in the hallways. And then there was this Jewish individual who was hiding inside a piano. He escaped from the piano, presses his foot on one of the keys of the piano just as the Nazis were waiting in the hallways downstairs in the house, and they hear him striking the key, and they all run upstairs and they basically barrage him and all the other inhabitants with holes. They just shoot them, and whilst this is happening, to accompany the rattling of machine gun fire, the muzzle flashes and all the screaming and wailing of people dying, you have this Nazi soldier who was playing the piano really, really elegantly, and I think that shows that the Germans, for a time, that they were how would I describe it? From them you had incredible composers, and you could say that they were the quintessence of sophistication, refinement, and culture. And yet, paradoxically, they were capable of these barbaric calamities, and juxtaposing the violence with the delicate, cultured music playing. I think that was an extremely powerful symbolic scene, and I think that it speaks a little more to what we are capable as humans. We're able to bizarrely and very paradoxically hybridize worldviews that are completely antithetical to one another. We're just bizarre, complex individuals, and certain systems and incentives can destabilize and some of the balance between good and evil in us very, very quickly, even with a minimal amount of effort. And very soon you're able to do these completely perverse and insane things to people. So, I mean, that's it from me. I think that I'm going to ponder and ruminate on and reflect a bit more on this video. I think it's going to shape, as I reflect on it, I definitely think it's going to shape some of my views on how I should carry myself, how I should see others, and just examine just more closely, am I really capable of this evil? Because I know we all are. but really reflect on what could be potential precursors and making sure that I have that under control. And I know that everybody else feels like they have things under control, but as World War II shows, that's not necessarily true. Individual, peasants and regular civilians, average Joes and Janes, even people who are considered quote unquote upper class, very quickly they're able to become channels and agents of evil, whether they like it or not. So thank you very much for looking at me look at this video. I think it was a very important topic, and I hope to see you next time on the next video. You take care. Goodbye.